All right, fellas. So the next topic for discussion here is the infamous clause that some of our colleagues in MMA media had to sign in order to cover the Jacksonville trio of UFC events. And ESPN did a little reporting on this. This clause was intended to keep some of the protocols of the COVID-19 procedures, trying to keep that under wraps and trying to limit any sort of bad press that they would get. But anyway, let's just read a little bit from the ESPN report as far as what the clause itself said. So it reads as, quote, "The participant shall not and shall cause its affiliates, agents, and representatives not to defame or disparage any of the released parties in any medium whatsoever in connection with the activities. Without limiting the generality of the foregoing, the participant will not suggest or communicate to any person or entity that the activities have been or will be held without appropriate health, safety, or other precautions, whether relating to COVID-19 or otherwise." So, of course, the Mixed Martial Arts Association, or Mixed Martial Arts Journalists Association, yes, the MMAJA, they released a statement initially. This is the first statement that they released. "It is our opinion that this document is overly broad and overreaching in its scope and may interfere with the ability of media members to do their jobs fully and effectively. We are advising members not to sign this document, even if it means foregoing in-person coverage of these UFC events." After the Journalists Association released this statement, the UFC amended their contract. Now, I'm sure it wasn't just because of that statement. There was a lot of backlash about this. We heard a lot of things related to this clause. And it even became a subject within the post-fight press conference for UFC 249 as well. But anyway, after the amended contract was put out there, the Journalists Association released this statement in response. "While we are encouraged by the UFC's willingness to adjust the wording of the agreement in response to concerns brought by the MMAJA and others, we still cannot advise members to sign this agreement, which we still regard as unnecessarily restrictive." So, fellas, this is something that should hit rather close to home for us three. I know, Pat, I've joined you covering an event live. I know you've been out on your own doing events, as I have. Mike, I know you've had your experience on the ground at events as well. So, I mean, I don't want to personalize this so much, but it's hard not to, when we could have been covering this for our respective outlets. And you, Mike, I mean, you live pretty damn close to where these events took place. So presumably you could have been among those media members just as a matter of convenience, if nothing else. But let's just put this out there. I mean, would you have signed that agreement?
Right. So first and foremost, I would not have signed this agreement, but that actually comes from a different reason than one might think. My style of coverage, my style of reporting, and the content that I produce is not necessarily predicated on being at an event or being there live. So for me, it would have been easier to kind of step away from the event and forego covering the event in person, as the MMAJA pointed out in the document. For me, that wouldn't have been as large of an issue as it is for other people and other media members, be it because of the type of coverage they provide or the outlet they provide coverage for. Now, with the body lock, we're both privileged and cursed. It's a blessing and a curse to not have access or to be just getting access, because on the one hand, you don't have it, but on the other hand, you can't lose it. But the other side of that is our coverage doesn't necessitate live stories. In MMA media, clicks sell, views sell. That's why you see a lot of Conor McGregor articles and very few articles about someone debuting in the LFA. It's just the way that the media works. But with the body lock, because we don't have a corporate overlord, we're able to kind of get by not providing event coverage for each event. It's something that we're able to avoid. So for me personally, I would not have signed the waiver. And I know it's very easy to now, many days removed, say, oh, I wouldn't have signed it. It's a very difficult and different situation when you're presented that waiver in the hotel after you've traveled and agreed with the company you work for to cover this event live. So it's a very difficult decision, but I believe I would not have signed.
Pat, what about you?
Well, I mean, first and foremost, just to put it out there, if any corporate overlords are watching this, by all means, please, Body Lock needs a corporate overlord. We need that money. But with that being said, so here's I'm gonna just give a glimpse of reality because of I know as you've been covering stuff as well, I'm curious to hear your answer on it. I guarantee that if I flew down there and I was trying to rush and get everything set up and try and get my space and do all that, and somebody from the PR was just like, oh, hey, you just got to sign the safety waiver. Just go ahead, sign it right here. I probably would have glanced it over, signed it, and then held it right back thinking it's just a standard what have you waiver. Would have maybe read the entire thing depending on when they got to me. But if they handed it to me right as I'm trying to set up or do interviews, when I'm boots on the ground, it's very possible that, especially from some of the UFC PR people, I've had good relationships with a couple of them. I trust them to just be like, hey, let's do this. And, there's this, now that the wording is out there, there's this concern about, I know John Morgan's talked about whether or not the UFC was trying to, just cover themselves and it was more of an oversight, or whether there was some, more restrictive wording behind there on purpose. That's kind of, obviously been a big hot topic as the UFC has gone ahead and amended the agreement. At this point, though, after seeing the amended agreement and after basically realizing exactly what it says, I would not sign it. And even though, again, I've done live coverage, I like live coverage. I'd love to do it more. In speaking with a conversation with Dan Lust, who's a sports lawyer, where we talked about, again, how this waiver might go over into other sports such as the MLB, NFL, all of that. He said one thing that stuck out to me from that interview, which you can find on the Body Lock YouTube page, by the way, is that, he said, basically, if you as a reporter went and then you just tweeted out like, oh, this is good protocols, but to be honest, I don't really feel safe, that could technically be counted as disparagement. Just that statement, even if it was as lighthearted as that. And that to me just sends red flags all over, where I wouldn't sign that thing without a lawyer and without making sure I know exactly what I'm signing up for. So that's my reasoning behind it.
I think you two bring up excellent points there, because my take on this, as far as, covering events live, Pat, just like you say, I love it. I love doing it. It's a fun part of the job. And I think you can get a lot of meaningful information there if you're there at the event with the right mindset. That being said, when you are trying to make it to an event and the traveling involved, and we all know what it's like to be rushing to the airport, barely got time to pack your bags and whatnot. You're trying to find a hotel in some strange city and whatnot. When you get a document to sign that says that I kind of would be expecting to sign something. I would go there expecting to sign a basic safety waiver, just saying that the UFC is not responsible if I catch COVID-19. I would expect that and sign that without any thought, especially like you said, if it's from PR people that you have a good relationship with, and it's something you're kind of expecting. All right, it might slide into the table. And I'll tell you this, speaking to one media member who was there, said that's exactly how he signed it. He said he was in a rush, he signed it, and then later on, when he's talking to the other credentialed media members, they're like, "Did you see that clause?" And he's like, "I have no idea what you're talking about." So that's a very distinct possibility. Now, knowing this, though, knowing this, I couldn't sign it. I mean, I will refer back to a conversation I had with a colleague of ours, Jay Petrie, who's the associate editor at Sherdog and also a co-host on my Walkout Network show Unleashed. He said that, he's a lawyer, and he said, like, yeah, half of this really isn't even enforceable. When they're trying to make you sign away the rights of relatives that you live with as well, like, you're not legally able to do that. Like I couldn't completely sign away things for my son if my wife doesn't agree to it. And I damn sure can't sign away things for her if she doesn't agree with that. So a lot of this isn't even enforceable. I mean, he went on there saying like, "Hey, I'd sign it because I know it can't really be enforced." So that's one take on it. But if you had this document provided before a media member left town, I think you would have seen quite a few people opt out and say, "Hey, we're not comfortable with this," even if it isn't enforceable, because it just kind of sets an ugly tone of kind of policing what sort of coverage that we can have, and especially at a time like this where the UFC pushed forward at a time where no one else in the sports world wanted to, for good reason, where there was so much backlash, where we had 3 fighters connected to all the iterations of UFC 249 have contracted COVID-19, or at least thought they had contracted COVID-19, between Lyman Good, Alexander Hernandez, and Jacare Souza. The UFC should expect questions. They should expect some level of scrutiny as far as what's going on, especially if these media members, who, by the way, have their own lives and families to be concerned about, are there in a professional capacity to report on what they see. So the idea that you would have any document there to restrict this in any way, shape, or form just doesn't bode well with me at all. So whether you want to take the rogue approach of saying, I'm gonna sign it because, hey, it's not enforceable and screw you, or at the very least, I can leak information out confidentially to friends who aren't here, and they can report on these things. Yeah, you can take that approach. But if you just decided to opt out, I don't see what's wrong with that. In fact, kind of puts a lot of us in a very, very tricky situation that I don't think we should have to face at all and expect to do our jobs in a proper fashion.
Yeah, I definitely agree. And I think that's where the MMAJA intends to step in, because this is a very difficult ethical quandary for anyone who's covering the event to deal with. And I think you both raised a very good point there about the clause being sprung on you at the event. That's something I wasn't necessarily taking into account, because my only understanding of this clause came after the clause was published, after it was spoken about. So I kind of ignored that. And you bring up a very good point that would make it I feel like now that you say it, I probably would have signed that agreement without fully reading it in the moment. Although, I don't read the terms and conditions when I update my iPhone. I know I'm a sinner, but yeah, no. But I think the very important thing for me is that the clause states that you will not suggest that any activities have been or will be held without appropriate health, safety, and other precautions related to COVID-19 or not. Appropriate is the word that strikes me as the main issue here. Obviously, disparagement itself, Dana White likes to say that it's only for untruths, but as we learned in our interview, Pat, with Dan Lust on the Fight Business podcast, that's not necessarily true. It can be anything that is critical, depending on how broad the law or the clause is being interpreted. We don't have appropriate health and safety standards for the coronavirus and holding a UFC event amid the coronavirus. We don't have anything like that because this is an unprecedented pandemic, an unprecedented time. To say that you can't call something of the UFC's inappropriate, how are we gauging that metric? What is appropriate? Who do we defer to? Is it the UFC's legal team, the UFC's medical team, the state the event is in? How do we determine what appropriate is? And if we can't determine what appropriate is with a consensus, how are we going to enforce that? How are we going to determine what is appropriate, what isn't? Obviously, the UFC doesn't want people to lie and say no one was tested for the coronavirus when they were. But for reporters to not be able to report freely, or to feel like they may not be able to report freely, casts a large shadow of doubt on anything that's going on.
Very, very well said. Yeah, I definitely am very uncomfortable with how this whole thing turned out, especially when I think the idea that they feel that they could push forward without anyone questioning their protocols just seems like madness. And, in a time like this, especially considering, let's just run it back to Jacare Souza. Now, it was reported that he contracted COVID-19, most likely from his wife, who had the virus. Now, they found this out in the screening in Jacare's screening, when he got to the event site or to the fighter hotel, that he had some contact with someone with COVID-19. So they apparently put some sort of social restrictions on him as a result in the build up to this fight. So you can question, just off break, we can question the actual social distancing that was put upon him, considering the Fabricio Verdum video of Jacare and backstage hugging it up and chilling out with all the other fighters on the card. So we can go ahead and put that in a separate box. But how about this? How about the screening took place once he got to the event site? You know, if you're doing basic things like that wrong, instead of screening them and finding out that he had direct contact with someone that's infected before he left, which seems like that would have been a lot smarter. Seems like that would have been a lot safer. Seems like something that someone with, you know, I don't know, an iota of intelligence would want to question, especially if someone with that iota of intelligence questions things for a living. Just a thought.
And what occupation would that be?
It's weird.
I'll take UFC Shield. That's the occupation. That's what it's called.
Well, and one other point to this, because that's a great point. It's, you know, why didn't they test Jacare at home, especially if they thought he had direct contact, or, you know, at least, you know, they said that they were going to quarantine him in some form or fashion, but that clearly didn't happen. Like, at least do that, and then you've at least covered yourself. But I mean, another thing to bring up with all this is, so we talk about the unenforceable part, right? Same thing that Jay told you is exactly what Dan Lust told us. You know, a lot of it's unenforceable. A lot of it, you know, if it went to court, it still has to be, you know, tried in that sense, but it would mostly get thrown out. But here is one thing about that. As someone that learned a very hard lesson last year on some BS from a small town. I grew up in a small town of, you know, person that I won't go into it too much, but a person that I knew from that small town is now a cop and does not like me. It's been a whole thing. And so I ended up, you know, getting arrested on a charge that was changed multiple times, and it ended up being disturbing the peace or something like that. After they changed it 3 or 4 different times. First it was refusal of ID, some other thing like that, which is ridiculous in itself. But I got that easily thrown out. I got it, you know, expunged from my record, got, you know, a rebuke from the attorney in terms of that it was poor police work and it was a huge, you know, waste of time, waste of resources, was terrible. Got that all, you know, thrown out. But I can guarantee you that I still have a huge chunk of change carved out from my bank account, paying for a lawyer and paying for the court fees just to get it thrown out. So imagine, it's one thing if you've got a dinky little town coming after you, but imagine you've got the UFC coming after you with a part of that clause that says, hey, we're doing it in Nevada on our home turf with our lawyers. I mean, think about having to fight that off, even if you know that part of it is unenforceable, even if you know that's like, oh, okay, well, they can sue me for this or they can go after me for this, but, you know, it's going to get thrown out. The amount of money that they could make you spend to do that is I would imagine most of a journalist's salary, if not all of it, for a year or two. So that in itself is another thing to think about. Is yes, you can get it thrown out. Yes, you can sign it and say whatever. But if they do end up taking you to court, then you're going to have to pay a huge amount of money on your own, or the site's going to have to pay for it. It's that in itself is another factor to take into account for this whole thing.
Pat, I didn't know you were a criminal mastermind.
Yeah, I want to say Thug Life OJ. Whoa.
I know, Thug Life, man. Thug Life. It's. I know I look it too, so, you know, just, you know, stereotype.
Living that thug life, racks and racks and racks at the judicial system. Well, you're a dangerous man, Pat. You're a dangerous man.
That's what it is, man. Is what it is. Just saying.